Good morning, friends. It's lovely to be here. And good morning to all of us in strange times. It is strange times with the virus, something so tiny that is causing such huge change and such huge threat to people in so many places. And strange times, too, to think about a year after a horror attack visited by a person of broad cultural Christian affiliation to a community of Muslims in Christchurch. For some it's a year, but for others it's just yesterday, or this morning, or a minute ago, or now. We'll talk today about the thirst to belong and the need to find belonging outside of places of convenience or habit. It's not directly related to the anniversary, but it's not related either. Our text, as you just heard, is John 4, an encounter between Jesus and a woman from Samaria. She is a loved figure in all Christianities, I think, and her conversation with Jesus is extraordinary. In the Eastern tradition, both Catholic and Orthodox, she's named. She's just called the Samaritan woman in many of the Western traditions, including the Catholic Church that I'm part of. But in the Eastern Orthodox and Eastern Catholic, she's named Fotine, light-filled or luminescent one. And that's what I'm going to call her today. I can't imagine it was her name, because it's a Greek name. But you never know. But by a gesture to think of the importance of people's names, it's better than just something else. She is a rich feature of the Gospel of John, and she is, it seems, thirsty to experience and remember herself in a new way. Just like Jesus, I think. Often we see one person as the site of conversion and the other person as the site of the converting. But I think to follow the Gospel is to think about the reciprocal, surprising changes that happen when people meet people. Unexpected, rather than coming in with an echo of a colonizing idea to say, I know what you need. I don't need anything, but I know you do. What's your name? Sorry, I do have a quiet voice. Thanks for turning it on. I've just been saying some blasphemy for anybody who because of her identity as a Samaritan and because of the way her own people treat her, she may not find it so easy to break free from the constraints of culture or other people's imagination of her life. And she is, like many of us, keen to find a way to be more free in herself and more free from the things that people project onto her, just like Jesus. And so firstly, a little context about the Gospel of John and about Samaritans. So John's Gospel is the latest Gospel written, it's thought, and it's distinct from the other Gospels. Gone is any reference to the kingdom of God. There's no reference to the kingdom of God in John's Gospel. And for this Gospel, heaven is here already. Eternal life is to be experienced in the way we experience the here and now. And there aren't any demons in John's Gospel either, which is a marked change, especially from Mark, where demons are so important in the way that Mark imagines the world and imagines power. And instead of a load of miracles, healing, John just has 7 signs. And often they're accompanied by significant long dialogues. It's a beautiful and very distinct Gospel. The extended dialogues, you'll probably know some of them. Jesus and Nicodemus, Jesus and Fotine, Jesus and the authorities, Jesus and the crowd, and Jesus and the crowd. And sometimes these dialogues go on for long chapters, and bring in multiple conversation partners. The conversation with the man born blind, for instance, includes him, includes some authorities, and then includes the parents of this man as well. And the conversation with Fotine is also one of those particularly extended dialogues. And she sits with other partners, really, dialogue partners of Jesus in the 4th Gospel. And those dialogues are frequently filled with conflict and misunderstanding. The conflict of belief and unbelief, of perception and imperception, of getting it right and getting it wrong. What do you mean I need to go back to my mother's womb and be born again? Things like that. Even the mild, smaller conversation with Mary Magdalene at the end of the Gospel, where Mary Magdalene says to Jesus, "Are you the gardener?" And John's Gospel is structured around creating a little echo, an artistic echo of the Garden of Eden. So she's right and not right, all at the same time. So these dialogues serve as a way of embodying the message of Jesus as a tool for his listeners to this Gospel to embody in their own lives. And some people think, and there is great value in having multiple interpretations of a single text. I don't think there's any good way to think about a text thinking it can only mean one thing. Maybe that's the poet in me, but I think it's also the person who's, like many of us, been part of religious fundamentalism, to think we are always healed by plural rather than dominated by singularity. And so there's great value in thinking of other interpretations of this. Some people think that the conversation between Jesus and Fotine is a way of symbolizing a discourse between the Jews and the Samaritans. So to hop, skip and jump through centuries of history, and I'm sure there's historians here, so apologies to you in advance. Samaritans, it's thought, were a remnant of Jews left behind after the initial conquest of the 10 northern kingdoms, the 10 northern tribes of Israel, by the Assyrians in about the 7th century before the Common Era. And those who stayed behind, or perhaps more accurately, those who were left behind, intermarried with other peoples who came in there. It's a trade route, phenomenal trade route, very important in all kinds of, I suppose, what we'd call European to North African trade. It's a very lush area also. So there was all kinds of merchants and other people moving there. And the Jews in those abandoned kingdoms who stayed behind became known as the Samaritans. And the Samaritan Torah, because that's what they call it, maintains many of the features of the Jewish Torah. And in fact, when what's considered now to be the Torah was being put together, many of the inaccuracies of the received Jewish texts were corrected by looking at some of the texts from the Samaritan Torah. So they're so close. It's like Catholics and Presbyterians, perhaps. Jesus met what woman? What would she be? Depends where you start, I suppose. Or what religion do you think Jesus was? There's an extraordinary biblical scholar, Sandra Schneiders, and she suggests that the 5 husbands that are referred to, she sees this as a symbolic dialogue. She suggests that the 5 husbands you hear is a way of embodying the 5 accusations of infidelity that the Jews make of the Samaritans in the Hebrew Bible. There's one point in accusation to say, 5 things I will hold against you, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And so Sandra Schneiders suggests that this is a possibility of a way that she's kind of embodying her people. Maybe a little bit like that film, The Two Popes. Nobody's suggesting that The Two Popes is accurate in terms of a transcript of conversation, but that it's an artistic way of embodying frames of thought and modes of being when it comes to the question of contemporary Catholicism. So we do that today as well as in the past. And in each of these interpretations, whether it's a historical event, whether it's somehow a composition of a few events, or whether it's purely a symbolic understanding, there's questions to do with how a person fits with the identity that they are given and the identity that they seek. Fotine is one of the most richly depicted characters of John's Gospel, I think. And when Jesus speaks to her, she questions his audacity in speaking, and perhaps also questions her safety. It's so easy to think of she of the 5 husbands. Another way to look at that is to think she whom 5 men had come to, 6 men that were known. Was she wondering, was Jesus going to be the 7th? So it isn't necessarily just quick-wittedness and audacity that she speaks from, but perhaps from deep knowledge and a deep practice of safety and distance. So when Jesus promises her water that will never run out, she says to him, you don't have a bucket? And it's magnificent. I think it's the closest that John's Gospel gets to humour, really, which isn't a great accolade for that. But anyway, she's quick-witted and undaunted and intelligent and observant and engaging. And she is wise about the world. And while there's no direct reference to humour or an energy between them, I think the tone and description of the open-heartedness of their language with each other shows her as a person at ease with her language, insightful, wary about other people's power, and not ashamed of her needs. And yet she is a sole actor. And Jesus too, a person attentive to power, aware of other people's needs or desires or projections onto him, aware of the need to sometimes create profound safety for himself at the risk of his life. I don't like to think of her as a recipient of the gospel. I like to think of Jesus and Fotine as joint participants in the life that was calling them both. And Jesus has found a companion in her. He is often finding time away from his own people and his own family and his own followers, his own religious belonging, really. He belongs and he doesn't belong. His belonging is complicated. It's in and out. 1 foot in, 1 foot out. And he has things to say to his own, but he finds himself on the outside, but not totally. He doesn't want to be exiled, I don't think. And certainly the different Gospels portray the level of exilic experience that Jesus has in different ways, but he is in and out. And Jesus and this woman and Fotine have much to share with each other. It's no surprise to me that they had what seems like an elemental recognition of intellect and experience and intuition in their encounter with each other. All of this brings us to think about how do we belong and what thirst do we have to belong. In our thirst to belong, and I suppose I'd like to say that belong is seen sometimes as an absolutely lovely word, but it can be terrible. Sectarianism begins in belonging and then turns bitter when it needs an enemy to sacrifice over and over. People do terrible things in the name of belonging. It can be beautiful and it can be brutal all at the same time. People sacrifice their integrity. People sacrifice other people. People treat members as a part of another big other without treating them as individuals. And we reenact the wars of history in the stories of today and escalate hatreds and get caught up in old stories. And when I was younger, I spoke Irish and English, and at 5 I asked my parents, why don't we speak Irish all the time? Gaelic, some people call it, but Gaelic is an umbrella term for 3 languages: Scots Gaelic, Irish and Manx. So we call the Gaelic spoken in Ireland Irish. And I learned about the English, and I have no time for empire. I consider empire to be perhaps the original sin of Europe. But I know that most people today living in England are either unaware of the impact of their empire or else feel very far from it, even though people in former places of empire are both aware and feel very near to the ongoing impact of that. So hating the English today might feel fantastic, and it might give me a great sense of belonging with some political allies of mine, but it is a diminishment of them, and ultimately me. And it implies that the Irish are pure, and all you have to do is to read Ignatiev's extraordinary book, How the Irish Became White, to realise that the Irish, much in all as we did suffer, and we also caused suffering in a way that was just a quick turnabout. You know, a person who might have been displaced from their land in the famine went on to become part of the Trail of Tears displacing indigenous people in North America, sometimes within the same year. So belonging needs to be approached warily, and we need to ask critical questions about the rules of belonging that are imposed on us. And what groups do we learn about? I'm not from here, so I don't know. But usually, like Jews and Samaritans, it can particularly be neighbouring groups who are too close for comfort. And I think perhaps the Catholic Presbyterian thing is a way to think about it. You can think about that horrific imposition in Rwanda of the Hutu and Tutsi, categories made up by the Belgians to decide who looked more European. Let's get, in terms of a considered European nose, and let's give them more power because they're a minority. Let's create hatred and war between people. There was no ethnic division of Hutu and Tutsi. And some diabolical imagination said, let's come up with words that are local too. So it doesn't sound Belgian, it doesn't sound French or Flemish. Let's do that. That's a form of belonging. And it's a form of belonging we need to be very careful about and to always ask ourselves critical questions about. And most violences against another group begin in the imagination, both of ourselves as well as the other. We might imagine we need to be protected, which then means we might imagine that we need an enemy. And so we look for an enemy, whether we have one or not. And then they become an enemy because we treat each other in enemy-making ways. We imagine they are corrupt because of blah, blah, blah. And we imagine that we are not corrupt because of blah, blah, blah. Very convenient ways of thinking in really simplistic understandings. And this isn't a metaphor for Twitter or social media. We've been doing this for a long time. Twitter and social media are just the latest version of an old habit of humanity, which is to find comfort in the practice of war. Violence of attitude begins in the imagination of the other. And even, I'd like to put forward the desire to fundamentally change another to be like me, to socialise you or them, to teach them the ways of decorum. We need to consider what point of power are we looking at. Within Christianities today, thank God, there's lots of conversation about hospitality, but I'm always curious to wonder, do we imagine ourselves as the host when we think of ourselves as practicing hospitality? Or do we imagine ourselves as the guest? Because the host, like when I host people in my house, I know all the rules. And I've made all the food. I don't need to worry about my food intolerances. But other people might come and just think, oh, well, I really feel welcome. I've got something that I'm a bit concerned about. And when it comes to strangers meeting strangers, who is the host with power? And who is the guest figuring out what are the rules of protocol? And will I or won't I offend them? Or will they or won't they be talking about me as soon as I leave? Recently I worked with a group where they were very concerned about how Muslims treat LGBT people, a Christian group. They were phenomenally concerned. And they had read various bits of the Quran, and they had read multiple articles about how Muslims treat gay people, LGBT people. I'm gay myself, so I was asked to speak to them about it. And suddenly it was quite strange because this group was not known for its love of the gay people. they could tolerate their own intolerance of LGBT people, but they couldn't tolerate the others' so-called intolerance of LGBT people. They could admit a spectrum of subtlety within their own practice that they could not allow to imagine that that might be present in whoever the other were. And so I said, well, let's just talk about ourselves for a while. I think the Muslims can look after the Muslims. If we need a dialogue of true exchange, we can arrange that, but only with homework and humility. So the thing that we need to pay attention to is what is it like to deliberately place ourselves on the edge of a community? Because there are ethical, and I suppose I'd like to say holy and gospel-based questions to be asked out at the edge. And that isn't just for people who feel forced to the edge. I think it's for everybody. Edges aren't a bad thing. The edge of me is my skin, so edges are needed. Nobody else is in my family but my family, and people who kind of marry or sleep their way into the family. And so how do we imagine what a positive experience of border might be? How can borders be places of openness and dialogue, especially in a strange time where touching and borders are closed to each other as we look at the transmission of this pandemic? But it gives us opportunity, by a little bit of Lenten withdrawal, to reflect on the importance of borders open, safe, and touch open, consensual, safe. Jesus and Fotine were both on the edge, and the only way into a bigger imagination of their civic belonging was for each of them to bring people along with them. She rushed home and said to her people, "Come and meet the man who told me everything I ever did." And she invited her people across a sectarian divide to learn from someone of so-called otherness. And that was complicated because Samaritans imagined that Jews felt superior. And she wasn't saying, "Come and teach this man." She was saying, actually, he does have something to teach us. And that's a very courageous and gracious way of imagining the kind of civic belonging we need. Sometimes you don't want to learn from somebody who comes from that other group because you think they've practiced terrible things. True as that might be, the possibility of ethical and civic imagination is to say, maybe I do have something to learn from them. That's hard, and usually your own will distrust you as a result of that for a while. And Jesus needed conversation with his followers because they were shocked at his having a private conversation with a woman from Samaria, with Fotine. Was it because she was from Samaria? Or was it because she was a woman? My guess is that it was probably more of the latter. I think we see this over and over again today. Years ago, when I lived in Melbourne, I got a lift on a motorbike back from an old friend of mine from the city back to the suburb where I was living, and got off the motorbike. We hugged goodbye. She was an old friend. I'm still in touch with her. And afterwards, somebody said to me, "You need to be above reproach." And I mean, what I wanted to say was, I'm gay. I am so far from approach regarding this. But it wasn't about me. It was about her. The automatic assumption that of people's reading of her motivation, of her life. That was just in 2000 in Melbourne. So I think the idea of the audacity and the visual reading of encounters is something that we need to be very attentive today and not imagine that it's a naive thing of the past. Jesus had the daring, and I'm sure he needed to improve, but Jesus had the daring to believe in the fundamental imagination that women were people and had minds, imagination, power, and independence. It should not be shocking to say that, but it is shocking to say that. In a strange way, one of the messages of this text today is for us to seek belonging outside of the places of our belonging, to push the boundaries, to imagine that our way of life as groups will be enhanced by meaningful encounters, truthful encounters with people on the other side of things. And not just for the point of view of saying, "Aren't you lovely? Aren't you absolutely delightful?" Maybe that's okay for meeting one, but eventually to get to the stage of meaningful, honouring, honest, intellectual, human, inspiring and surprising conversations with people from the so-called other. Not that we'll find that we're all the same at the end. I don't know what we'll find at the end. That's the whole point. The possibility is to invite us into a moment of learning. And learning is learning something you don't know, and perhaps you don't know about yourself and the other. And that's the invitation that we're invited into here. I can't give a 5-point plan about what will happen if we do that. But I think it's a good thing to do it anyway, because we find it over and over again in the encounters in the gospel. To be open to ourselves in the space created between us and the other. I think this is a practice called repentance and surprise and fundamental conversion to the idea that there is a God who transforms us. And we meet this God in the light between us, Fotine, the abundant, sharing light. And she today is our beckoning call. Gamani dia an bríthir seo in our agama, in our mail, agus in our ga agus crí. May God bless God's verbs in our minds, in our mouths, in our words, and in our hearts. Amen. Prayer 1 year on. Jesus, in your name, much horror is done. People cultured by cultures that have grown around you imagine that the horror they create is justified in the name of right. You, who knew torture, know that torture is never true. We, who today mark an anniversary of horror, note with horror what we are capable of doing. In the face of this, may we remember the 51 members of the beloved community and their families and their friends and their colleagues and the people who greeted them in the shop in the morning and the futures they'll never see. What starts in an ungenerous imagination can lead to horror. So may we remember to nurture in us an imagination that is generous towards all others. Because you did this, and in you, people on different sides of empire found themselves with a new relationship to power. Amen.